The first light of dawn trickled by means of the narrow arched window of the stone mobile. Cold and unadorned, the room was barely massive, sufficient for a woodcot, a crucifix on the wall, and a shelf holding a single publication, probably the Psalter or the Guideline of St. Benedict. It was here, in this austere and sacred house, that Brother Thomas opened his eyes each and every morning, not to the sound of bustling streets or birdsong, however, to the gentle peal of the Matins' bell, calling the monks of St. Abbey to prayer. The 12 months used to be 1253, and lifestyles past, the monastery partitions was marked via turmoil, wars between nobles, harsh winters, and uncertainty. But at the back of the fortified gates of the abbey, time moved now, not via the rhythm of politics or kings, however via the rhythm of prayer, silence, and devotion. The first hour, matins, and the call to darkness. Brother Thomas, a novice of just 18 winters, rose from his cot, his breath noticeable within the kick-back air. He wrapped his tough wool habit tighter around him and slipped his toes into leather-based sandals. He would not converse. Phrases have been a luxurious reserved for special occasions. Silence, in these sacred hours, was once no longer just a self-discipline. It used to be a doorway to God. By means of candlelight, the monks processed to the darkened church. Shadows danced upon stone pillars, because the brothers took their locations within the choir stalls. The abbot, seated below the fine crucifix, gave a nod. Then, in low resonant tones, the mantra commenced. Domini, labia, me aperis, O Lord, open my lips. Matins, the night vigil, was the first of 8 canonical hours. It was once a time of darkness, when the soul all set itself to face yet another day, not in worldly toil, but in religious labor. The chant echoed through the Navasolemn, reverent, eternal. Right here, on this cloistered world, time itself bowed earlier than the divine, the vow of silence. The language of the Psaltermus had taken his first vows just a few months previous. Though now not but wholly professed, he had already embraced the quietude of monastic existence. Silence used to be among the most complex yet lovely of the disciplines. In the outside world, silence was vacancy. Right here, it was once presence. Presence of God, of cause, of inside battle. Even within the refectory, the place foods were shared in common, not a word used to be spoken. A lector would learn aloud from the lives of saints, or the writings of the church fathers, while the monks dipped tough bread into pottage, or nibbled on salted fish. They listened, now not best with their ears, however, with their souls. Thomas, frequently, struggled within the stillness of night, or the long hours of labor. Ideas of his former life again to him. His father had been a merchant in York, hoping Thomas would take up the trade. However, after a pilgrimage to Durham, the place he encountered, the incorrupt body of St. Cuthbert, the boy's coronary heart grew to become inward. The monastery grew to be his calling. But the silence could be deafening. The cloister, a circle of time and stone earth. Center of the monastery was once the cloister, rectangular of open space, surrounded by way of covered walkways. Here, monks walked slowly in contemplation, often with their hoods drawn low. The stone corridors echoed with the shuffling of sandals and the rustle of habits. At the middle stood a garden, its herbs and plants cultivated no longer for magnificence, but for remedy and non-secular symbolism. Brother Thomas normally located solace here. He would stroll the cloister when not assigned to scriptorium or kitchen. Responsibility. Underneath the arches carved through lengthy dead masons, he felt himself a part of something monstrous and everlasting. These identical stones had obvious generations of monks come and go. Each had carried the identical burdens, whispered the same prayers. The rule of St. Benedict ruled there every second. It used to be a rule no longer of tyranny, however, of steadiness between prayer, work, gain knowledge of, and leisure. Ora iti labora, Thomas would remind himself, pray and work. The scriptorium, ink, illumination, and discipline. Thomas's favorite responsibility was once in the scriptorium. The room was flooded with mild from tall leaded windows. Here, monks copied sacred texts, working in silence at long wooden desks, quills scratched softly on parchment, ink dark and rich, cautiously ready with soot and vinegar. Illuminators delivered color to the margins. Great blues produced from overwhelmed lapis lazuli, reds from cinnabar, and gold leaf that gleamed like the solar. Although Thomas had not but been trusted with illumination, He marveled on the skill of Brother Edric, whose depiction of the Virgin and youngster gave the impression nearly alive. Copying texts was once a sacred act, a way of keeping divine knowledge for generations to come back. Every letter used to be an applying, every line a prayer. However, it was once, now not, without undertaking. One mistake could spoil an entire web page. Hours misplaced. Thomas had learned to hope earlier than each shift at the desk. Lord, guide my hand and guard my thoughts, work, and worship. The monastic pursuits the hours handed now, not with the aid of clocks, however by means of the tolling of bells and the action of the sun across the stone flooring of the church. After lauds came top, then terce, sext, none, vespers, and finally every hour referred to as the brothers to pause their work, return to the church, and sing their devotion. The day was once damaged no longer into morning and afternoon, but into sacred intervals. Even labor, whether within the fields, the gardens, or the kitchen, was once performed with mindfulness. There used to be no rush, no cut-off dates, handist rhythm. Brother Thomas, as soon as used to the chaos of the city, determined an unusual peace in this constitution. It was once as if time itself had slowed to the percent of the soul. He mainly cherished Compline, the final prayer of the day. The candles flickered because the monks sang in unison, their voices tired however devout. Later on, they processed in silence to their cells. No words have been spoken until the subsequent daybreak. Temptation and reflection. The inner battle, but now not each moment used to be serene. There have been days when Thomas's mind wandered again to the laughter of children on the market, to the scent of roasted meat, to the contact of sunlight on his naked dermis. These weren't sinful ideas. Now, not always. But they distracted from the path. The devil, the guideline warned, does now not normally shout. He regularly whispers. In these moments, Thomas would kneel within the chapel by myself and pray, not for perfection, but for persistence. Lord, I am weak, but I am yours. The opposite monks, too, carried burdens. Brother Matthew, once a knight, bore scars beneath his addiction. Brother Cuthwine, elderly and blind, whispered the psalms from reminiscence. Each and every man had a narrative, and each had surrendered it at the altar. Existence apart, but deeply connected. The monastery used to be an international unto itself, isolated from the world, yes, but no longer disconnected. The monks prayed for the world every day, for the ailing, the bad, the death, the kings and peasants alike. Pilgrims would oftentimes arrive at the gates, looking for safe haven or medication. They have been fed, cared for, and then sent on their means. Thomas once tended to a boy whose legs had been twisted from start. As he fed him bread and bathed his sores, he realized something profound. The monastery did not get away the arena's agony. It embraced it, modified it. In the cloister, he had not fled existence. He had observed its deeper fact. In the depths of winter, when snow crusted the stone cloisters and frost etched its lacework across the abbey's windows, Brother Thomas started to fully grasp that the monastic existence was now not with ease a retreat from the arena. It was a battlefield, now not of swords and shields, but of soul towards self. Under the silence and rhythm, there have been storms, and each monk, irrespective of how religious, faced them. On my own, the bell tower loomed high above the monastery, a constant sentinel looking out over the sacred grounds. Its best bronze tongue summoned the brothers to prayer, to foods, to confession. But for Thomas, in these cold months, it had emerged as greater than a clockwork of day-to-day rhythm. It had grown to be the sound of judgment. The bell's toll, a reminder of mortality. Abbey bell rang 8 times every day, each chime a division of time sanctified by means of ritual. However, at night, when Thomas lay on his woodcot beneath a thin woolen blanket, the echo of the bell still haunted him in his goals. It was once as if the stone partitions had absorbed its voice and whispered it again in sighs and murmurs. He, in most cases, dreamed of standing underneath it, alone, as the great bell commenced to swing. With each ring, he felt the load of his doubts, his past, and his flesh, urgent in it. Was now not worry of hell that seized him, but fear of unworthiness. Used to be his soul, real suited for lifestyles so set apart. One freezing morning after Lord's Thomas approached Brother Edric in the cloister stroll. "Have you ever doubted your position here?" he requested softly, risking the rule of silence in a confidential moment. Edric, older by way of 2 decades and worn like historical leather, smiled faintly. Day to day, that's how I know I belong. Thomas contemplated these phrases long. After confession and judgment of right and wrong, the voice of fact every Saturday. The monks had been required to confess their sins. This was no typical ritual. It used to be a laying naked of the soul. And in the tight-knit confines of monastic life, even small sins loomed colossal. A stray thought, a flash of envy, a forgotten prayer, a whispered phrase out of flip. Thomas sat earlier than the confessor, head bowed, fingers knotted. I dreamed of my old lifestyles again, Father, of track and laughter. I longed for it. I woke with the want nonetheless warm in me. The confessor, a tender friar named Brother Oswin, listened silently. He did not rebuke, most effective whispered. The rule of thumb reminds us that ideas, by myself, will not be sins, but what we do with them could lead us off track. Thanks in your honesty. Then, he placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder and whispered the absolution in Latin. It used to be in these moments that Thomas felt the monastery's authentic strength, no longer in punishment, but in forgiveness. Every man here carried his possess move, but they did so together. Every step ahead, a grace. The infirmary, the physique's restlessness, used to be a steady accomplice in medieval life, and the monastery was once no exception. In February, a deadly disease of the purple cough spread among the learners. Fever, wheezing, blood. One by one, they were sent to the infirmary of bloodless, shadowy chamber perfumed with sage and vinegar. Thomas, though not but ill, volunteered to support our inclined to the unwell. His arms trembled as he wiped sweat from Brother Aldred's brow. The boy, more youthful than Thomas with the aid of 2 years, had not spoken in days. The infirmarian Brother Crispin moved like a shadow effective, silent. He taught Thomas methods to mix salves from comfrey and thyme, learn how to pour boiled wine over wounds to cleanse them, and the right way to read signs of demise within the fingernails and lips. It is God who heals, Crispin stated. However, he offers us the herbs. Thomas realized extra in that week than he had in 12 months of studying. He realized that the physique, just like the spirit, was vulnerable and that mercy was the best calling. One evening, Brother Aldred awoke in brief and whispered, "Do you suppose the angels sing like we do at Compline?" Thomas smiled, though his eyes had been wet. "Higher," he mentioned, "but they realized it from us." The wasteland fathers and the internal barren region. As he grew more desirable in self-discipline, Thomas began to study the sayings of the desolate tract, fathers early Christian, monks who had fled to the Egyptian deserts to seek solitude with God. Their lives were marked by means of severe austerity, visions, and even battles with demons. Thomas examined Abba Anthony, who lived in a cave and wrestled with temptation. He examined Simeon Stylites, who lived atop a pillar for a long time. These weren't memories of myth, they were the very roots of the monastic tradition. But in addition, they raised questions. Could one truly in finding God most effective in silence? Might asceticism go to a ways? One night, by means of candlelight, he wrote in his journal, "There's a wasteland in each man, no longer of sand, however, of silence. I have got to pass mine slowly, for the winds there are usually not obvious, but they carve the soul like stone." He was once beginning to peer that solitude was once no longer purely an outside state, however, an interior, and even within the walls of the abbey, a man could be lost or discovered. The scriptorium revisited, an experiment of Indaransatho, he had gained prefer for his regular hand. Thomas discovered the scriptorium, increasingly making an attempt. Lengthy hours hunched over parchment gave him a crick within the neck and aching eyes. Worse, nonetheless, have been the corrections when the grasp scribe, Brother Ethelwald, stated blunders with a sharp look and silence more cutting than phrases. Sooner or later, Thomas smudged the ink on an whole folio of psalms. The page was ruined. He anticipated scolding as a substitute. Brother Ethelwald took the web page, stared at it for an extended second, and handed him a knife. Scrape it. Start again. It was a sacred lesson. Even ruined pages would be redeemed, so he scraped the parchment, flaked clean beneath the knife. The monk's finest advantage, he was once learning, was not piety, used to be patience. Temptations of the mind and coronary heart, the flesh was one thing, but the mind, though, the way it wandered. Thomas determined himself, longing for his sister's voice, the scent of bread baking within the hearth of his childhood house, even the joys of taking note of minstrels on market day. Music was once forbidden inside the cloister, retailer for the chant. But in his mind, melodies drifted by means of like wind through bushes. Commonly, he imagined himself going for walks, not in the cloister, but alongside the river Ouse, barefoot, laughing, free. He confessed these goals, over and over, but they did not stop. It was Brother Gottrick, an aged monk with shaking hands and a serene face, who instructed him, "Don't worry the dreams, present them to God. The guts will on no account be emptied, have to be stuffed both with desire or with devotion." So Thomas started out to transform these moments. When he longed for his household, he prayed for them. When he remembered laughter, he smiled and thanked God for the reminiscence. When he felt starvation no longer of the physique, however of the guts, he read the Psalms aloud in his cell. "My soul thirsts for thee, my flesh longs for thee." The abbey had not yet broken him. It used to be beginning to type him. Vigil, a night without sleep in Lent. Every monk was once required to spend one night time in solitary vigil, preserving prayer from sundown to sunrise. Thomas approached the duty with trembling anticipation. He would remain within the church by myself, wrapped in his cloak, seated earlier than the tabernacle, the only mild a flickering candle beside the altar. The night time was endless. His intellect wandered. His knees ached. He fought sleep like a warrior fights the tide, and in the center hours somewhere between terce and daybreak he wept, not from suffering, but from the surprising awareness of his possessed smallness, his possessed starvation. For God, within the silence, he in the end heard not voices, no longer visions, but anything deeper, a peace that had no name. When the solar eventually rose, and the other monks returned for matins, Thomas remained kneeling, nonetheless, silent, modified. The 12 months pressed ahead. The frost gave strategy to rain, and the fields beyond the monastery partitions started too inexperienced. On the earth external, spring introduced planting and exchange, taxes and taverns. But inside the high stone partitions of St. Lethrid's Abbey, spring converted little. Time still grew to become on the axis of prayer and silence. The only calendar that mattered was the liturgical one, and the only growth was that of the soul. Brother Thomas, now prior his first 12 months as an amateur, was once starting to recognize that the monastic existence was now not handiest, a trial of solitude. It used to be a trial of submission, and nothing tested the soul like obedience. The guideline of Saint Benedict, the e-book that rule used to be ever reward, no longer handest as a bodily booklet, copied and recopied in the scriptorium, however, as a living fact, woven into each breath and gesture. It informed the monks when to rise, when to consume, when to speak rarely, and when too rapid. It commanded humility, silence, reverence, and specially obedience. Obedience is step one of humility, the guideline declared. At first, Thomas had determined the constitution comforting. It eliminated option, and with it, temptation. However, now, as the days grew longer, he started out to consider its true weight. Obedience was once effortless when the command made sense. However, when it seemed foolish, tedious, and even unjust, it grew to be a crucible. One wet morning, Thomas was ordered to scrub the pig stalls in the back of the kitchens. It used to be an obligation most likely given to younger learners, or lay brothers. He felt his delight flare. I was to aid Brother Edric within the scriptorium, he protested. Brother Roderick, the strict sub-prior, met his eyes without flinching. Today, you're going to serve the pigs. If Christ can wash the toes of fishermen, that you may shovel dung. And so he did. In the mud, in the stink, beside animals that snorted and shoved. He labored except his shoulders ached, and his habit was once filthy. That evening, he knelt in church with blistered hands and burning cheeks. It was a lesson he would not disregard. Pride dies slowly unhandest, via obedience. The hierarchy within the cloister-century, to Thomas's expectations, the monastery was not a position of ultimate equality. Though the monks had all renounced worldly titles and possessions, a refined hierarchy remained. The abbot held authority over all. Beneath him had been the prior, the sub-prior, the cellarer who oversaw provisions, the infirmarian, the grasp of inexperienced persons, and others. Each had tasks and have an effect on. Brother Thomas realized quickly that obedience supposed navigating this human constitution with care, even as the abbot, Father Anselm, used to be style and measured. Not every advance used to be gentle. Brother Roderick, in certain, was identified for his severity. a tall, angular man with a gaze like flint. He not often smiled. He enforced silence with strictness, corrected error in chant with a sharp tone, and as soon as sent a novice to the fields for an entire week for drowsing for the period of lauds. But Thomas also noticed a different aspect of him. One night, he handed the infirmary and glimpsed Roderick kneeling beside a death brother feeding him broth together with his possessed fingers, whispering the paternoster into his ear. Authority, Thomas realized, used to be now not cruelty, it was burden, and in many instances individuals who bore it have been the loneliest of all. The assignment of neighborhood within the imagination of the outside world. Monks were solitary, but the reality was once more difficult. Solitude existed within a community. They prayed together, ate together, labored facet by part, and the place there are persons there is friction. Thomas began to struggle with Brother Gilbert, a fellow beginner. Gilbert was once older, sharp-tongued when allowed to speak, and seemed to excel in everything. He sang extra confidently. He quoted scripture from reminiscence. He corrected Thomas during readings. At first, Thomas bore it in silence. However, resentment grew. Within the quiet moments of the day, his mind filled with infection. He started out to restrict Gilbert in the cloister stroll. He imagined rebuttals he would, under no circumstances, say aloud. Then came a lesson from the abbot himself. For the duration of a chapter assembly, the abbot learned from the rule: if a monk has a complaint in opposition to one more, he shall go to him in humility and search peace, lest anger fester like a wound. After the assembly, Father Anselm regarded directly at Thomas and mentioned gently, "Satisfaction and bitterness are walls we build within ourselves." That night, Thomas approached Gilbert in the library. "I have envied you," he mentioned quietly. "Forgive me." Gilbert appeared amazed, then smiled faintly. "I've envied you, too." They mentioned no more. But after that night, something transformed. They started to sit collectively at foods. The silence between them grew warm, not bloodless. The apply of Lectio Divina to enhance his spiritual center of attention. Thomas was assigned a everyday hour of Lectio Divina sacred reading. It used to be not be taught, but communion. A slow meditative stumble upon with the Word of God. He read the Gospel of John, pausing on each verse. Within the opening was the word. He read to not analyze, but to obtain. He repeated phrases, aloud, allow them to echo in his mind. The sunshine shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. More often than not, he learned in the backyard of the cloister, letting the wind flip the pages. One afternoon, a sparrow landed beside his FT and stared at him. He whispered, "Even the birds belong to God." Lectio became a replicate in Scripture. He started out to see his own doubts, his weaknesses, but in addition, his hope. The phrase didn't scold. It embraced. Fasting and mortification lent again, and with it came fasting and bodily mortification. The monks ate sparingly bread, water, routinely turnips or boiled beans. Meat used to be forbidden, holy. Some even wore hair shirts under their habits, or slept without blankets. Thomas was once instructed towards extremes, but he selected to upward thrust previous, sleep much less, and chorus from spices in his meals. It was a type of discipline, meant to not punish the physique but to grasp it. But self-discipline walked a great line. One night time, Thomas fainted during he had eaten too little, prayed too long. He awakened within the infirmary, scolded via Brother Crispin. God does not ask you to destroy the body he gave you, the infirmarian mentioned. Humility, Thomas learned, also meant accepting one's limits. The arrival of a stranger in mid-April. A stranger arrived at the gate, a layman, bearded and ragged, asking for shelter. His title was once Elias. A former soldier became pilgrim, who had walked from the coast to York and now sought sanctuary. The abbot accepted him 3 days of rest. Thomas was assigned to speak with him, a rare permission of speech, given to minister to guests. Elias spoke of war, of loss, of visions he had visible on the battlefield. "A concept I would in finding peace on the earth," he stated, "but the world has none." Thomas listened, supplied him bread and water. "I've determined some peace here," he said with no trouble, "but it's a peace won by means of hearth." Elias nodded. "Might be, I'll stay longer." And he did. He remained, first as a visitor, then as a laborer. Ultimately, he took the first steps toward fitting a lay brother. His story reminded Thomas that the monastery was once not a situation for the ideal but for the damaged. seeking remedy. The interior circle of Gracius, the season turned and Pentecost approached. Thomas observed himself modified. Now, not yet, professed, nonetheless young, nonetheless finding out, but quieter inside of the guideline no longer felt like a cage. However, a trellis, his soul, as soon as wild, was beginning to grow in its sample. One night, after Compline, he remained in the church lengthy after the others had departed. The sunshine from a single candle danced throughout the stone ground. He prayed, now not with words, but with breath. He no longer asked for visions, or force, or solutions. He with ease waited, and in that waiting there was once peace. The monastery, for all its silence and contemplation, was once now not a place of idleness. Though the guts of monastic existence beat in the chapel and the cloister, its lifeblood ran via the fields, workshops, barns, and granaries. Each and every mission, every motion of hoe or hammer, each and every crumb of bread kneaded and baked, was part of a satisfactory offering, labor made sacred via intention. For Brother Thomas, now nearing his second year within the abbey, the rhythm of work used to be now not unfamiliar, but it had not grown less difficult. It had, nevertheless, come to be deeper. The hands, once clumsy and sore, had grown hard and certain, and the soul, as soon as stressed, had begun to understand that labor was no longer basically responsibility, it was once devotion. Ora et, the guideline made flesh. The motto of the monastery was once carved above the south gate. Ora et labora, pray and work. It was once no longer easily an excellent eat, used to be a commandment. The rule of Saint Benedict made this balance valuable. A monk who prayed but did not work was idle, and a monk who worked without prayer used to be worldly. The monastic existence demanded each. It was once this fusion of physique and spirit that modified probably the most mundane tasks into choices to God. Thomas mirrored on this as he bent over rows of cabbage, his fingers in the soil, the spring sun warming the again of his neck. He didn't speak, however his heart was once no longer silent. Every action of his arms became a wordless litany. For the hungry Lord, bless this ground. For the in poor health, Lord, make stronger these roots. For my soul, Lord, instruct me to grow. The other brothers moved slowly by means of the fields, some sowing, others weeding, a number of breaking rocks at the fringe of a new plot. They wore habits patched with years of labor, their faces sun-browned and targeted. There was no rush. Work was no longer a means to profit, it was a path to grace. The monastic farm, sustaining the body, the abbey lands, improved past the walls. Monastic farms offered most of what the brothers wanted: vegetables, grains, herbs, milk, wool, honey, and regularly fish or eggs. They traded little and bought much less. Self-sufficiency was no longer only a necessity in the almost always unstable medieval world. It was once a virtue. Brother Thomas spent many hours in the gardens, tending to leeks, garlic, onions, and beans. Within the orchards, he realized to prune apple bushes, to accumulate cherries and plums in baskets woven via the lay brothers. Once a week, he labored with Brother Atharek, the beekeeper. The hives have been stored near the brink of the woods, the place wildflowers flourished. Thomas realized the way to transfer slowly, how to recognize the bees. The honey they produced used to be now not most effective. A infrequent sweetness within the monk's strict weight loss planet was also utilized in treatment salves, mixed into tonics, and sealed into wax tablets for writing. The monastic kitchen, meanwhile, was once a humbler position. No rich meats or spiced pies. Ingredients have been easy: porridge, pottage, bread, and broth. On feast days, maybe dried fruit or cheese. Every morsel used to be a present, each rapid a reminder of discipline, and normally, earlier than the meal, a prayer of thanks no longer only for the meals, but for the labor behind it. The instruments of labor, hammers, axes, and quills. Thomas had continuously imagined the monastery as a situation of books and candles, and it used to be, but he quickly discovered the clang of hammers, the grinding of millstones, and the ring of chisels in the workshops had been equally sacred sounds. He spent a month apprenticed in the mason's yard. The Place brothers carved stone for a brand new chapter condo. Brother Winston, the master mason, was a quiet man whose fingers had been at all times covered in dirt. He confirmed Thomas the best way to learn the grain of a block. Easy methods to tap gently earlier than carving. Easy methods to pay attention. For the whisper, a fracture within the stone. Every block has its fact. Winston instructed him, in finding it, or it's going to damage. Thomas observed. This wisdom echoed in the scriptures. Had now not Christ referred to as Peter the Rock? Had not the church itself been developed upon the groundwork of the apostles? Even in stone, God spoke. He also spent time in the woodshop, crafting bowls and benches, mending carts, and helping with repairs after the spring storms. He marveled at how every brother, irrespective of his station, took joy in shaping whatever lasting along with his hands. Even the scribes in the scriptorium were workers. Their instruments had been finer quills, knives, ink, and gold leaf. However, their labor no less taxing. One illuminated manuscript might take months to hold. Each flourish, every border, every gilded initial, was once an act of devotion. The rhythm of the hours, the bell dominated all. Work was not ever performed in lengthy stretches. It was once consistently broken with the aid of the divine office, the 8 canonical hours of prayer. Even in the fields, if the bell for sext rang, the brothers would discontinue their ploughing or harvesting and process back to the chapel. It used to be this rhythm that made their lives holy. No project, however mundane, was ever separated from prayer. The return to the chapel, the kneeling on stone floors, the chanting of psalms, this continuous respiration inside and outside of labor and prayer, formed them like water, shapes, stone. Thomas started out to believe time differently. On the planet beyond the partitions, time was once measured in prophets, in seasons of conflict and peace, in the births and deaths of kings. But right here, time used to be measured in prayer. Every moment belonged to God. Sacrifice and the body. Monks, our bodies bore the rate of this labor. Backs bent, fingers cracked, feet blistered from strolling barefoot on rapid days. But they hardly ever complained. Thomas generally reflected on this, mainly when his own limbs ached. He remembered his father's words, spoken lengthy ago when Thomas had refused to hold a heavy sack. "You'll be a scholar, not a laborer." But now, he labored more than he learned, and by some means, he felt richer for it. One night time, after a day of rough work, Thomas could now not sleep. His muscular tissues burned, but in that discomfort, he discovered a style of clarity. The body, like the soul, needed to be damaged open before it could be reshaped. He wrote in his journal, "I notion I got here, right here, to flee the sector. However, God has proven me the arena in the soil, in the sweat, within the agony of arms and the cracking of seed. I feel him most when I am least myself." Feast days and Restelthown, their lives had been rigorous. The monks did have fun. Feast days introduced relaxation from labor, longer ingredients, more cheerful chants, and normally not often music played on simple flutes or rebecks. At the present time marked the saints, the holy days of the church, and the pleasant turning, features of the liturgical year. On the feast of St. Benedict, Thomas stood with the other rookies in the refectory and heard the abbot converse of their founder. Benedict knew that the soul can't flourish without the physique, and the physique cannot thrive without the soul. So he gave us a life of stability, not because it is handy, however, because it results in holiness. After the meal, the monks walked within the garden. Some spoke in low voices, accepted during the excursion. Thomas walked beside Brother Godric, who requested, "Do you still dream of your historical life?" Thomas' proposal for a long second, "Generally, but now I wonder if it was a dream, man, that is the waking." Godric smiled and positioned a weathered hand on his shoulder. "Then your roots are growing deeper. Work as worshipy means of summer seasons finish." Thomas had begun to appreciate something profound. In the monastery, nothing was once wasted, not time, not effort, no longer affliction. Even failure used to be used by God. He remembered, as soon as, early in his novitiate, shedding an unplete jar of honey, it shattered, golden liquid spreading across the flagstones. He had wept, ashamed of the waste. Brother Crispin had helped him clean it. No bee weeps for misplaced honey. It effectively starts again. Now, Thomas noticed the wisdom in these words. The monks' lifestyles used to be now not about perfection. It was once about perseverance. And so he labored. In fields and kitchens, in bloodless mornings and lengthy afternoons. His arms, once smooth, had been now calloused. But when he knelt within the chapel, these same palms held the psalter with reverence. The same fingers that pulled reeds or carved wooden now traced the signal of the pass. In labor, he had found prayer. In hardship, he had observed peace. In silence, he had located which means. The sector external, the monastery, marked time with the instruments of guise, the upward thrust of rulers, the cycle of taxes, the changing colors of the bushes. But inside the walls of St. Lelred's Abbey, the monks lived with the aid of a different rhythm, a sacred clock, drawn now not on parchment or sundials, but within the soul. It used to be known as the liturgical year, a substantial and solemn tide of fasts and feasts, of solemn, ready and pleased proclamation. It did not begin with January, nor result in December. Its axis used to be not the sun or the moon, but the incarnation and resurrection. And for Brother Thomas, now practically 2 years into his novitiate, this cycle had come to be the very breath of his being. Each and every feast, each and every vigil, each and every chant and ritual had carved itself into the fibers of his days. The sector might spin in chaos, however, within the abbey, time had been baptized. The cycle starts a belved introduction, and the longing for gentle. The liturgical year started out no longer in pleasure, but in longing. Introduction, which intended the coming, was a season of quiet expectation. It started in late November, as the land external darkened and the nights grew longer. Within the cloister, candles flickered extra more commonly than fire. Voices grew softer. Foods were less difficult. Thomas cherished this season most of all. There used to be something sacred in the ready now, not a passive delay, but an energetic hunger for the light. The monks learned from the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, passages stuffed with eager for the approaching Messiah. The persons that walked in darkness have visible, a pleasant, gentle. Within the church, the altar used to be stripped of vegetation. The chants became extra somber, extra reflective. On Sundays, a single candle was once lit each week on the Advent wreath, a growing flame. Within the shadows, Thomas most likely knelt within the chapel for the period of the nonetheless hours of the early morning, and imagined himself among the many shepherds, observing the horizon for indicators of daybreak, after which, on the night time of December 24th, the silence broke. Christmas, the Feast of Incarnation, middle of the night mass on Christmas Eve, was one of the vital few instances. The abbey burst into full light and music. Bells rang in the bloodless dark, echoing by way of the stone halls, just like the voices of angels. The brothers processed into the church, each and every carrying a small candle. The air was once filled with the scent of incense and pine branches, laid at the altar. The mantra modified. Unto us a baby is born. Unto us a son is given. There was no present giving, no feast of flesh or wine, but there was joy, pure, austere pleasure. Bread was baked with honey. A bit further, butter was once brought to the porridge. Brother Edric carved a small nativity in wood, and it was once placed underneath the altar Christ, wrapped no longer in gold, but in humility. To Thomas, Christmas was once now not a day. It was a mystery that God had a available silence in weakness. Into the cold and straw of the sector, it made the monasteries possess simplicity, feel wealthy with meaning. Epiphany, the star and the country's wealth. Days later came the feast of Epiphany, the appearance of the Magi, the revelation of Christ to the Gentiles. It reminded the monks that the child born in Bethlehem was no longer just for Israel, however, for every person. The mantra echoed, Regis Tharsis, et insulae munera, offerant, the kings of Tarshish and the isles shall carry items. In the refectory, golden stars, product of parchment, were hung from the beams. Brother Thomas was once chosen to learn aloud throughout the meal, recounting the story of the megastar of the ride, and the items of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. It used to be a feast of revelation and a delicate reminder to the brothers that their quiet, hidden existence used to be a witness to the arena. Lent the experience into the desolate tract, but the brightness of Epiphany faded rapidly. Soon came Lent, the excellent 40-day fast. The center of the monastic year. Ash Wednesday arrived, without trumpet or bell. One after the other, the monks entered the chapel, bowed their heads, and felt the ashes pressed into their foreheads by means of the abbot's thumb. Bear in mind, man, that thou art work dust. The words pierced Thomas more deeply each and every year. They were not spoken with despair, however, with gravity. Lent used to be now not punishment. Tit used to be purification. During nowadays, the monks ate little bread, boiled vegetables, bean stew, no butter, no fish. The hours of prayer had been lengthened. Sleep was once shortened. Voices grew thinner from fasting. Even the chants modified, becoming minor in tone. laced with sorrow and hope. Thomas volunteered for a diurnal nighttime watch in the course of Lent. He would kneel in the freezing chapel, long earlier than matins, reciting the penitential psalms. Have mercy on me, O God, consistent with thy loving kindness. He did not weep with guilt, however, with longing. Lent used to be the monastery's possessed desert. It used to be the situation, the place the soul met its possessed want, and at its finish, after weeks of silence and hunger, came a night that shattered the dark. Easter, the light returns. The Easter vigil commenced in darkness. The church was unlit. The monks gathered external across the paschal fireplace, the one mild in the night-time. Thomas held his breath as the brand-new candle was lit, its flame rising high. Lumen Christi, the sunshine of Christ. Within the chapel, the Exalted was sung. The satisfactory candle used to be positioned close the altar. The bells rang again after 40 days of silence, and the chant, again with force, Christus resurrexit, Alleluia. For the primary time, for the reason that Lent started, the brothers embraced. They sang with full voice. The refectory served fresh bread, cheese, and sweetened wine. Thomas might hardly converse. His body used to be susceptible, but his soul felt alive. The cycle of death and resurrection had not been theoretical, it had been lived, and through it, whatever inside him had died and something had risen. The feasts of saints and martyrs throughout the year. Different holy days dotted the calendar, feasts of saints and martyrs. On each and every the monks would sing the story of the saint in the course of the vigil, adorn the altar with herbs or flowers, and ponder lives of faith, sacrifice, and usually martyrdom. Thomas principally loved the feast of St. Cuthbert, whose relics lay not some distance away in Durham. A Northumbrian monk like themselves, Cuthbert had lived as a hermit and died with a reputation for holiness that endured centuries. His feast day felt personal, real, regional, as if the saints walked no longer in legend, but within the identical. Sandals because the brothers, Thomas would write, saints should not stars above us, they are footsteps earlier than us. Nowadays, although modest, have been stuffed with warmness. The brothers smiled more. Generally, they shared stories. One feast day, Brother Gottrick even instructed a joke and Thomas laughed for the primary time in weeks. Even joy, right here, was once a type of worship. Traditional time, the lengthy, inexperienced season after Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit's hearth was once celebrated, came the long stretch of natural time, weeks and weeks, without pleasant feasts or fasts. To outsiders, this could have gave the impression dull, but to the monks, it used to be the season of development. Inexperienced vestments were worn. The chants became regular and calm. The scriptures thinking about the teachings of Christ's parables, miracles, day-to-day lessons. It was, in the course of this time, that Thomas felt his soul settle into its form. There was no drama, no main issue, most effective hobbies, but in that activities, holiness grew quietly like roots under the soil. He wrote in his journal, right here, in the center of the 12 months, when nothing grand happens, I suppose closest to God might be this is the place eternity starts, effeveled no longer in noise, but in the trustworthy repetition of quiet acts. The end and the beginning, the liturgical 12 months ended with the feast of Christ, the King, a reminder that every one time, all life, all kingdoms belonged to God. After that, Advent would come again. The circle would shut, only to open over again. Thomas had come to love the repetition. He did not believe stagnant, it felt everlasting. The saints, the seasons, the psalms, they weren't memories. They had been companions. In the end, the liturgical year had no longer simply shaped his time, it had reshaped his soul. 1. The door to illumination. The scriptorium used to be the warmest room within the abbey, but it lay deeper in shadow than any cloister walk or dormitory telephone. Brother Thomas crossed its threshold for the first time in late autumn, when the harvest was once secured and the monks became from fields to books. A low murmur of quills on parchment greeted him, an insect-like song. Specified and tireless hand, the smell of lamp oil mingled with drying vellum, beeswax, and ink. Here, saints have been reborn in Pickman. Here, phrases grew to be home windows opening onto eternity. Brother Ethelwald, the master scribe, raised a lantern and gestured Thomas ahead. Don't forget, he whispered, your first responsibility is just not beauty, however, fidelity. We copy the word, so the word may replica us. With that riddle, He positioned a clean folio before the newbie and left him to think about the giant whiteness that awaited its destiny of letters and luminous vines. 2. Materials of heaven. Substances of earth. Earlier than Thomas would lift a quill, he spent weeks finding out to prepare the very epidermis upon which scripture would leisure. Calfskin soaked in lime water unless hair slipped free, stretched on a wooden frame, scraped with a lunellum blade, dried to translucence. Every hide bore scars, birthmarks, insect bites. The ghost of sinews, and Thomas used to be taught to honor these imperfections, not erase them. Christ rose together with his wounds. Brother Hugo advised him over the taut drum of vellum, and the gospel can dwell in improper flesh. Ink, too, was once an alchemy of humility. Gallnuts, beaten to powder, mixed with iron salts and wine. Carbon black amassed from smoky lamps. Gum arabic coaxed from acacia bushes a ways beyond Christendom. When the solution darkened, Thomas watched it capture the lamplight like watered silk, and thought of Genesis, and darkness was once upon the face of the deep. But when ink came from the deep, color sprang from fire. Lapis lazuli ground to ultramarine, dearer than gold. Verdigris scraped from bronze plates for inexperienced lead, tin yellow vivid as midday. Vermilion lethal because it was once glorious. Brother Edric, the illuminator, weighed every pigment on bronze scales, his fingers exceptional as a healthcare provider's. Stone turns into sky, he preferred to assert, and rust becomes leaf. All creation is conversion. 3. The rule of the Quillenly. After Thomas could mix ink without clotting and reduce a reed nib to a hair, with facet did Brother Ethelwald assign him a practice sheet. The alphabet of majusculus marched throughout the margin, rigid, towering capitals whose every stroke required a prayer for steadiness. Hours passed, candles guttered, the novice's wrist trembled. One blot and all was ruined. He scraped, rewrote, scraped once more, unless the parchment grew thin as eggshell. That night, in the dormitory, he dreamed of letters fleeing his pen like startled birds. Your hand is simply too rapid, the master advised next morning, tapping Thomas's knuckles with a willow swap. Let the breath guide the stroke. Inhale on the ascent, exhale on the descent. Word and spirit are twins. Slowly, Thomas realized to breathe the gospel into being. In principio erat verbam, every syllable unfurled on the percent of the heart, not the mind, and the silence inside of him deepened. 4. The dance of colors. As soon as every week, the copyists yielded their desks to the illuminators, and the scriptorium changed from monochrome live performance to riotous opera. Boards of pigment glimmered like hidden treasure, mortar stones rang underneath pestles, and bowls of egg tempera released a faint, sweet scent. Brother Edric knelt beside Thomas's one half-completed folio Psalm 23 and traced the blank preliminary D with a squirrel hair brush. David's Dominus deserves a gate of gold, he mentioned, outlining the letter with bowl clay. Thomas watched, mesmerized, as Edric pressed wafer-thin sheets of crushed gold onto the cheesy floor, then burnished them with the wolf teeth, unless the leaf blazed. Inside that molten body he painted a shepherd beneath an azure sky, crook in hand, lamb on shoulders. Hills rolled at the back of him in bands of malachite and ochre. A spring flowed silver, its ripples etched with the tip of a needle. All afternoon the picture blossomed, detail by way of detail. A tiny dragonfly, sprig of lilies, the shepherd's eyes lifted towards an unseen horizon. By way of dusk, the page perceived to breathe. Thomas felt tears upward, thrust unbidden. How can one pray after beholding this? He requested softly. Edric smiled. By means of letting it pray for you. 5. Vigil of the scribe. In wintry weather, the sunlight hours shrank to a light coin, slipping in the back of the hills before none. The brothers copied by way of lamplight, hunched like penitents, shadows wavering over their shoulders. Fatigue grew to be a penance of its own. Eyes blood-rimmed, fingers cramped, spines bent in silent crucifixion. But the work didn't slow. Monks in Kiev begged for new gospels. A priory in Wessex wanted antiphonaries. A bishop in Rouen offered a relic of St. Martin, an alternate for a psalter bound in silver. Thomas kept vigil long after Coppelen, a single beeswax candle, guarding the margin where he formed minuscule script. Outside, frost glazed the cloister garth. Within, every stroke was once a heartbeat. Midway, by means of the Magnificat, he felt sleep steal his vision. The letters swam. The traces blurred out of the blue, the quill jerked. A jagged curb scored the text, black as raven's wing throughout the Virgin's tune, his breath caught. One error might doom a folio, weeks of labor sacrificed. Panic clawed at him. However, then Ethelwold's lesson lower back. Christ rose, together with his wounds. Thomas steadied his hand, trimmed his knife, and began the delicate art of erasure, scraping fiber via fiber until the scar thinned, sprucing with chalk and bone, rewriting the verse in careful strokes. Through dawn, the wound used to be invisible, and the page more worthwhile for its hidden flaw. 6. Mistakes and redemption. Every blot might be healed. Brother Gilbert as soon as spilled a pot of verdigris across Revelation. The vivid green ate the parchment like acid, leaving a lacework of holes. Tears streaked his cheeks as he held the ruined sheet, but the master scribe in simple terms decreased his lamp and stated, "We will weave new leaves around the voids." John noticed heaven open. Perhaps heaven wished a window here. They devised a border of vines curling through the gaps. Every perforation changed into a blossom where angels perched with trumpets. When the manuscript used to be dispatched months later, the prior who bought it wrote back in awe, "Never have I visible the trumpets of judgment sound by way of wounds of fabric, green flame." Therefore, disaster grew to be revelation. Thomas learned, within the scriptorium, as in the soul, grace wastes nothing. 7. The golden web pageant, the heart of each pleasant codex, lay a single folio of unparalleled splendor, supposed to arrest the eye and anchor the spirit. For the abbey's new gospel, that honor fell to Brother Edric's incarnation page. Weeks before Christmas, he summoned Thomas at daybreak. On the desk lay a sheet bathed fully in gold leaf, so brilliant it gave the impression again lit, by way of daybreak itself. Upon this subject they might paint the Nativity. First, they sketched the collapse, thin brown ink, scalloped arches, hard stone. Then Mary, robed in lapis, cradling the tiny Christ whose halo shimmered white gold. Joseph, humble beside her, employees in hand. Above, a star of burnished silver burst with rays so quality they quivered like harpstrings. Angels rose in tiers, wings of emerald and cinnabar, and within the margin shepherds gazed in marvel whilst sheep nibbled the gilded floor. Day to day the scene glowed deeper, each and every pigment layered, every line sharpened. On the ultimate night, Edric touched a speck of white to the boy or girl's eye, and the page came alive. Thomas felt a hush descend, as if the ox and ass themselves held breath. He whispered, "Et verbum, caro factum est." The phrase had certainly been made flesh, ink and flesh, gold and breath. 8. Voices in silence. Thought speech used to be rare. The scriptorium possessed a vocabulary of glances, nods, and speedy indicators. A finger tapped twice on the desk, supposed inkpot. "Please," a small circle drawn in the air requested for the pumice stone. Hands lifted, shoulder, excessive warned of a spilled pigment. Over time, Thomas conversed together with his brothers on this mute dialect more fluently than he had ever spoken in the markets of York. Yet once per week, after Sunday chapter, the scribes have been authorized an hour of open dialogue to remedy textual puzzles. Debates flared over abbreviations, variant readings, the position of neumes in chant notation. Brother Cuthwine argued that a precise Gloria should comply with the Gallican lifestyle. Brother Roderick insisted on Roman utilization. Thomas listened, dizzy with scholarship, until the abbot's bell ended the parley and silence folded back like wings. These infrequent bursts of speech reminded him that writing used to be no longer isolation. However, communion throughout century scribes, in distant abbeys, fathers of the church, prophets and psalmists, all conversing in ink. 9. The reward of the Psalter winter deepened. Snow muffled the cloister and piled in opposition to the scriptorium shutters. One night the abbot summoned Thomas. To his gain knowledge of, on the desk lay a small quantity bound in faded leather, a pocket psalter, every web page penned by means of Thomas over the last year as hidden pastime. Miniature capitals danced with crimson prospers. Marginalia featured violets and finches. The textual content ran clear as river water. Father Anselm became the pages slowly, candlelight gilding his face. "This," he mentioned at last, "will be dispatched to Sister Mary at St. Hilda's Priory. Her eyesight fails. Your script may just comfort her. Take into account, son, our book's journey, the place we can't." Thomas bowed, shocked. His exclusive toil would emerge as one more soul's comfort. In that second he realized the proper vocation of a scribe, to disappear at the back of the phrases, leaving only mild for others. 10. The pilgrim's incat camp. A bedraggled pilgrim arrived, bearing a phial of red soil from the Holy Land and a small pouch of beaten madder rutitums for the abbey. Brother Crispin nursed the man's blistered feet, while Thomas watched the pilgrim hint at trembling. "Pass on the scriptorium door, on your colours," he murmured, from Christ's own road. They brewed the madder in lye, precipitated the dye into clay, and ground it to a crimson deeper than any of their shops. Thomas blended it with egg white and used the pilgrim's earth as beneath tone for a miniature of the through. Thus, far away Jerusalem bled into Yorkshire vellum, binding two worlds in one sacrament of colour. 11. Fire within the workshop. Tragedy struck on a windswept March night-time. A gust toppled a lamp, and the drying room hung with folios into flame. Brother Gilbert raised the alarm. Buckets flew. Smoke crammed the cloister. Thomas and others hurled snow onto the burning racks, hands blistering. By means of dawn the hearth was quenched, but 22 pages lay charred, their gold fused into blackened curls. Silence fell heavier than ash. Some brothers wept, others stared hollow-eyed. Months of labour, magnificence beyond Philos. But the abbot gathered them in the chapter apartment and said, "Job blessed the Lord when the whirlwind struck. We could do less." They sang Te Deum amid the smoke's bitter scent, and when the hymn ended, Brother Ethelwald opened a contemporary choir of vellum and exceeded each and every man a sheet. Work began anew that very morning. Later, Thomas would write, "The hearth verified the gold. What remained was purer than earlier than 12. The dwelling word spring returned, buds swelling on the apple bushes, and the brand new gospel neared completion. Folios had been sewn on linen cords, boards reduce, spine rounded, protecting stretched, delicate. Brother Winston long established clasps of bronze. Brother Edric inlaid a pass of jet within the middle panel. Sooner or later, on Pentecost Eve, the codex used to be laid upon the altar, veiled in linen-dotted vigils. The abbot lifted the veil. Candlelight struck the tooling. Colours blazed like stained glass. The text whispered its silent music. Thomas felt the congregation inhale as one. The abbot prayed, "Lord, may just this guide elevate your mile to every eye that beholds it, and may folks who penned it's inscribed within the e-book of lifestyles." The brothers processed forward, each kissing the cover. When Thomas's lips touched the leather baste, he tasted dust, wax, and anything like tears. He proposal of the calves that gave their skins, the bees their wax, the miners their lapis, the pilgrims their blood, crimson earth. All creation had conspired to beginning. These pages. And in that moment he understood. A manuscript was no longer in simple terms a booklet. It was a choir vellum, the bass, ink the tenor, gold the soprano, singing one long hymn of reward. 13. Epilogue. Ink in the veins that summer Thomas took his final vows. In the ceremony, he positioned his folded guarantees upon the altar beside the gospel he had helped create. When he lay prostrate on the stone ground, he felt the abbey's heartbeat beneath him, centuries of prayers thudding like drums in the deep. Later, in his cell phone, he opened a clean notebook. The primary page waited, titanic and expectant. He dipped his quill, breathed, and wrote, "The phrase writes us as we write it. Between the strokes of ink, I see the face of God." Then he closed the guide and blew out the candle, realizing dawn would in finding him once more in the scriptorium, where silence sings and gold remembers the solar. 1. The summons it used to be after Lord's, as the morning fog still curled like incense via the cloister, that Brother Thomas used to be summoned to the prior's mobile. The prior, a lean man with sunken cheeks and eyes sharpened with the aid of decades of silence, beckoned him ahead without ceremony. "There may be illness at the village of Linsthorpe," he said. "The sisters at St. Winifred's have requested support. Brother Godric is just too frail to travel. You're going to go." Thomas's coronary heart lurched. He had no longer left the monastery grounds in over 5 years. His world had narrowed, purified, shaped by way of the bell, the psalter, the stone partitions that had become as acquainted as his own dermis. The thought of stepping past them stirred unease. However, he bowed low and responded most effective. "As you command." The prior nodded. "Take the Gospel of St. Luke. The individuals will want more than medication." 2. The cloister opens the gates opened simply after prime. Brother Thomas carried a small satchel, a vial of oil for anointing, a loaf of black bread, a flask of vulnerable wine, and the gospel wrapped in waxed fabric. Beside him walked Brother Ivo, a thick-bodied man whose silence used to be not spiritual but functional. He had taken a vow of speechlessness for Lent. Although Lent was once now over, still, he gestured and grunted with affection. His presence, grounding. They walked underneath clouds, low and grey. The trees whispered above the muddy street, and birds trilled from unseen branches. Thomas's boots slipped on stones. The breeze smelled of moist hay and manure. He flinched on the raw noise of the world crows cawing, far off shouting, the hammering of a Cooper's retailer they handed closed the crossroads. He realized how gentle the monastery had made him. However, he additionally felt anything deeper. The world had now not transformed. He had 3 Linsthorpe in sickness. They reached Linsthorpe by means of mid-afternoon. The village lay in a hole between hills, a scattering of wattle and daub houses, and one sagging stone church. Smoke barely rose from chimneys. Chickens wandered, the muddy paths unclaimed. The silence was once now not holy, however heavy. A baby watched from a doorway, huge-eyed. His face was crusted with filth, and a fly crawled throughout his lip without resistance. Sister Cecily met them on the churchyard. She was once older than Thomas expected, her veil stained, her voice regular but exhausted. 10 useless, extra in poor health. She mentioned, "We suppose it's the bloody flux. It began after the fair final month. We've no physician." Thomas nodded. He had learned concerning the symptoms within the infirmary's books: dysentery, dehydration, unexpected loss of life. It unfolded like sin, quiet, invisible, cruel. Exhibit me the worst. He mentioned 4. Ministry amid decade. They worked by means of the night. Thomas tended to our bodies burning with fever, washed filth from straw bedding, fed soup to children too weak to chew. He anointed foreheads, muttered prayers, wiped mouths bleeding purple. The odor of health problem used to be all over the place, bitter and damp, laced with hopelessness. However, in every act, he remembered the phrases of Saint Benedict. Let him deal with the tools of the monastery, as in the event that they have been sacred vessels. And weren't these individuals additionally sacred? He took no relaxation. Beside him, Sister Cecily moved like a ghost, whispering relief, singing hymns as ladies wept into her arms. On the 1/3 day, they buried 3 more. No priest came. Thomas stood on the grave and read aloud from Luke. "Blessed are the negative, in spirit, for theirs is the dominion of heaven." One mum wailed. Thomas notioned her voice would ruin the sky. But when she fell silent, the stillness in a while felt like prayer. 5. A World of Wounds. Linsthorpe printed to Thomas a global. His cloistered life had hidden, uncooked, merciless, tangled with grief. He saw a boy steal a bird from a neighbor's hutch, a husband slap his spouse over a spilled bucket, an historical man curse God as he died. But, in the middle of this spoil, there were glints of light. A girl feeding soup to an orphan, a mother braiding her dead daughter's hair earlier than burial, a peasant offering Thomas a sliver of important cheese. He realized that grace didn't reside only within monastery partitions. It spilled out, uninvited, into the gutter, the plague cart, the broken heart. That nighttime, unable to sleep, he wrote, by using candlelight at the back of the church, "We flee the scepter to search out God. However, he walks here, in rags and sores and the eyes of the demise. I've washed his FT today." 6 reminiscences rekindled, being back among the humans stirred. Reminiscences long buried. He remembered his mother's kitchen, the scent of barley stew, the warmth of her arms. He remembered the market rectangular in York, boys laughing, cash clinking, the thrill of stolen apples. In probably the most sick beds lay a young man who reminded him of his brother, Edwin, freckled, Leanne, defiant in his affliction. Thomas tended to him for days, coaxing sips of broth, praying the fever would smash. He instructed him experiences from the gospel, and the young man listened with furrowed forehead. However, on the 6th day, he died. On my own, Thomas sat by means of the physique, numb. Then he rose, positioned a twig of mint on the boy's chest, and whispered, "You are not forgotten." 7. Returned to the cloister when the ailment ultimately ebbed. Thomas and Brother Ivo, ready to depart. The villagers offered them eggs, a carved comb, a woven cross of rushes. Thomas declined them all, but accepted a gentle riverstone from a little one, its floor etched with a single phrase in poor Latin, spes, hope. They walked back in silence, because the abbey came into view, golden in the evening, gentle. Thomas's throat tightened. The bells were ringing for vespers. A sound he had once taken without any consideration now struck him as the voice of home. He bathed, he confessed, he slept for 12 hours without waking, but within the days that adopted, anything in him had shifted. He knelt longer in prayer. He gave extra bread to the negative who came begging at the gates. He spoke extra gently to the more youthful newcomers. He understood now. The arena used to be now not anything to flee. It was once something to hold inside, in compassion, in reminiscence, in prayer. 8. The cloister inside in the chapter condo. He was requested to recount his trip. He did so in brief, with humility. No dramatics, no lament, only the facts and a closing notion. We plant seeds in silence, but they grow within the storms of the world. Later, in the scriptorium, he began a brand new manuscript, the Acts of the Apostles. But in the margin of the primary web page, he drew a simple leaning in, a go on the hill, and a monk going for walks among the in poor health. 1. The stillness after the storm. After the return from Linstorp, the rhythms of the abbey appeared both comforting and whole. The bell tolled, and Thomas rose. Psalms had been sung, and he joined. Bread used to be damaged, and he ate. However, something inside him had shifted like a rope pulled too tightly, a silence that no chant would cover. His suggestion he had grown superior through his mission of mercy. But now, again, in the cloister, he felt a weight descend upon his soul now. Not sorrow exactly, however, dryness, like the absence of rain in parched soil. The church fathers known as Itasi, the wasteland monks named it the noonday demon, and for Brother Thomas, it came without warning, creeping by way of his days with the quietness of rot. He wrote in his journal, "I wake to pray," and the phrases taste like ash. "I kneel, and my knees ache, but my soul does now not transfer. I chant the psalms, but I don't think the echo. It used to be the toughest trial, but not hunger, now not cold, no longer loneliness, but now secular vacancy. 2. The hour of the wolf. The monks called it Horolupitha, hour of the wolf, that hour simply before dawn, when the arena is at its coldest, and the soul at its most exposed. Thomas commenced to wake for the period of that hour. Sopping wet in sweat, his breath shallow, he felt unseen eyes in the dead of night. In many instances he imagined shadows moving within the corner of his mobile phone. He would attain for his psalter, fingers trembling, and read by using candlelight. Yea, although I stroll by means of the valley of the shadow of demise. But there have been nights the phrases brought no alleviation. He started out to dread matins, the early morning workplace, not for the reason that of the cold, or the effort, but given that it pressured him to stand earlier than God, when he might now not believe him. Was once this what the saints referred to as the darkish night of the soul? He remembered studying the lifetime of Saint Cuthbert, who had once spent an complete winter in silence, doubting the presence of God. The reminiscence gave him faint remedy. Probably this barren region used to be not punishment. However, passage 3. The return of the Erinawat made the silence worse, were the recollections not of prayer, but of the arena he had left in the back of. Linstorp had stirred things, faces, names, feelings he concept buried. One night time, for the period of Complen, he saw in his intellect the face of his mum, her hands chapped from work, her voice calling him in from the fields. A different time. He remembered a Lady Marjorie, a miller's daughter who as soon as smiled at him across the flow when he was 15. He had lengthy buried the idea of her. However, now it got here unbidden, as vivid as firelight. Shame flushed him. Desire is a quiet, patient factor. It does now not shout, it whispers. He confessed to the abbot, his voice barely above a whisper. I remembered a lady's face. I felt something stir. I attempted to nod. The abbot did not recoil. He only nodded and replied, "Temptation just isn't sin, Brother Thomas. Simplest ascent is, and even when we fail, grace waits." Still, the guilt gnawed at him. Bot 4. The brothers who fell in the identical season. 2 monks left the order. Brother Cadfael, a amateur with ease, vanished one morning. His addiction was once determined, folded on the bed. Word got here weeks later that he had joined a visiting merchant caravan. The older monks stated nothing. However, their silence used to be heavy. Thomas felt the loss like a damaged window in the chapel. Then, Brother Willimer, monk of 15 years, requested release from his vows. He wept earlier than the chapter. I no longer hear him, he said. No longer in the Psalms, no longer within the silence. I don't even recognize. If he's there. The abbot granted his departure with grace. That night, Thomas sat alone within the cloister garden. The celebrities wheeled overhead. He whispered, "I don't need to go away, but I am afraid. I'm dropping you." 5 phrases that fall flat. The psalms grew to become tougher. The Lord is my rock. He makes me lie down in inexperienced pastures. He can provide me from all my fears. But what if he didn't? What if these phrases were simply sounds, echoes of individuals who believed something lengthy ago? What if the monks had built their lives upon poetry, and not truth? Thomas dared no longer speak these ideas aloud, but they churned inside him. He found himself skipping traces within the readings, letting his voice drop for the duration of chants. He not knelt throughout the prayers. He just sat. Brother Ivo seen. He touched Thomas's shoulder after Lauds one morning and gave him a section of parchment. It learn, faith just isn't the absence of doubt. It's the choice to stand even when the ground under you trembles. It was unsigned. However, Thomas knew whose hand had written it. Point 6. The experiment, a fireplace. The abbey library had a small, hardly ever visited room. The place older monks saved fragile manuscripts and failed translations. Thomas sought it out. He needed solitude. Now not for prayer, however, for wrestling. There, among dirt and dim gentle, he determined the writings of Cassian, Evagrius, and Bernard of Clairvaux, monks who had identified the wasteland of the spirit, and written of it with aching honesty. Cassian wrote, "The higher the longing, the deeper the silence. God withdraws to not punish, however to make us thirst extra deeply." Evagrius, known as Acedia, the demon that walks at midday, the one who makes the monk need to sleep, to consume, to put out of your mind. And Bernard wrote, "The soul that can't think God ought to grow to be a beggar, knocking at the door of the phrase." Thomas copied these strains into his journal. He clutched them like lifelines. The fireplace of doubt nonetheless burned. But now he knew others had walked by way of it and survived. 7. The breaking point. One night, in his cell, Thomas fell to the ground. No longer in prayer, however. In fall down, his limbs shook. He could not breathe. He felt God had abandoned him. "I've given the whole thing," he whispered. "Why are you silent?" He wept, now not quiet tears, however shuddering sobs that tore from his chest. For minutes, he lay curled on the stone floor, shaking. When the trembling stopped, he lay there still, staring at the wood crucifix on his wall. And then something shifted. Now not a voice, not a imaginative and prescient handiest, a stillness, the type that follows weeping, when the physique can provide no more. In that stillness, a single line came to him, no longer from the Psalms or the Fathers, however, from his mother. "You are not alone." It was reminiscence, but it used to be additionally extra. It was presence. He sat up. The silence remained. However, it now not overwhelmed. It surrounded. It held him. 8. Treatment. The silence within the days that followed. Thomas didn't consider God rush again into his prayers. However, he not feared the silence. He entered it like a well-known room. He started to upward thrust early again now, not given that he felt joy. However, due to the fact that it was right, he chanted once more, no longer since the words made feel. However, given that they have been holy, he walked the cloister and frequently he smiled. Brother Ivo requested him, "Has the storm passed?" Thomas shook his head. "No, but I've realized to stroll in the rain." 9. A brand new sort of faith. There are two forms of faith. Thomas would later write, "There's the faith that sings, that sees, that feels, and there is the faith that walks through shadow, deaf and blind, but still moves ahead." He now possessed the second, and unusually, it was once more suitable. He returned to the script, his hands steadier, his eyes clearer. He wrote the Psalms again, but now, when he came to the verses of despair, he didn't skim them. He lingered. "Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord." And typically he delivered his possessed marginal notes. This is reality, no longer because he felt it, but seeing that he had lived it. 1. The cloistered circle. The monastery used to be a place of solitude, yet it was once additionally a situation of companionship. For every moment Thomas spent in silent prayer or solitary copying, he was once surrounded via the constant presence of brothers who shared his lifestyles, his struggles, and his hopes. The cloister was once a ringed garden, a sacred circle both bodily and non-secular, where monks walked together in silence, punctuated by means of the bells, the chanting, and usually, the quiet exchange of a glance. Inside these partitions, a brotherhood-fashioned, fragile but resilient family, cast by means of vows, shared labor, and the pursuit of holiness. 2. The friendships that sustained Brother Thomas determined an infrequent friendship in Brother Ivo, whose useful silence used to be a balm to Thomas's stressed spirit. Ivo's steadfastness reminded Philmus that words weren't the one method to keep up a correspondence grace. Then there used to be Brother Anselm, the novice grasp, whose smooth guidance shaped Thomas's first years. Anselm had fun like church bells in spring, and although his exterior used to be strict, his heart was smooth. And there used to be Brother Ulrich, the gardener, whose fingers coaxed existence from the earth, and whose reviews introduced light to cold evenings. Ulrich's humor used to be a secret prayer, a reminder that pleasure might exist even in renunciation. These friendships, although bounded by using monastic rules, carried Thomas via temptation, despair, and doubt. 3. The unspoken languagement lifestyles demanded silence but not isolation. The monks developed a rich language of gestures, appears and signs to keep in touch without speech. A simple nod with specific approval or encouragement. A raised eyebrow might sign a needed correction. A hand laid in brief on a shoulder might offer remedy. Thomas discovered to learn the sophisticated rhythms of his brothers, their moods, their struggles, their silent cries for aid. This unspoken conversation used to be each a self-discipline, and at present it fostered attentiveness and compassion without phrases. For confession and suggestion, silence used to be the rule of thumb. Confession used to be a sacred exception. The abbot or prior would hear exclusive confessions, providing guidance, absolution, and typically rebuke. Thomas remembered a night when he confessed his temptation. His recollections of Marjorie Ann felt an apprising relief in naming his struggle aloud. The abbot's words were firm but merciful. We don't deny our humanity, but we ought to grasp it. Let your love for God be higher than your longing for the sector. Guidance inside the brotherhood went past confession. In the chapter Condominium, monks shared reviews of non-secular trial, scripture interpretation, and the small victories of everyday self-discipline. These moments knit them nearer, making a communal resilience in opposition to loneliness and despair. 5. The tensions below the dependence is brother used to be no longer without its tensions. Variations in temperament, zeal, and opinion mostly triggered friction. Thomas recalled an argument between Brother Edric, the illuminator, and Brother Cuthbert, the cellarer, over the distribution of supplies. Edric, enthusiastic about his art, felt slighted by means of what he saw as neglect. Cuthbert, burdened with the aid of the abbey shortage, insisted on strict equity. Their dispute lasted days, casting a shadow over meals and work. The abbot eventually intervened, reminding them that charity was the greatest virtue, art or obligation. This episode taught Thomas that even in holy locations, human frailty persisted and humility was once the relief. 6. Acts of mercy. Within the partition's monastic existence used to be a microcosm of the arena's joys and sufferings. When Brother Gilbert fell sick, the brothers tended him with devotion, feeding, washing, praying. When beginners faltered, the elders patiently urged them. Thomas remembered how the monks gathered to remedy Brother William before his departure, offering prayers and embraces that transcended phrases. These acts of mercy, small and profound, had been the threads that wove the neighborhood collectively. 7. Shared rituals, shared hearts, the daily places of work, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline were the heartbeats of the abbey. Gathered in the choir stalls, voices rising and falling in Gregorian chant, the brothers became one body, one voice. Thomas found strength in these shared moments, when man or woman troubles dissolved into communal praise. Even in his darkest nights, the mantra reminded him, he was once not by myself. 8. The self-discipline of neighborhood's rule of thumb of Saint Benedict emphasized obedience, humility, and steadiness. Obedience meant being attentive to the abbot's instructions and to want an additional, even when complicated. Humility intended recognizing one's faults and valuing others above oneself. Steadiness supposed dedication to the position, the persons, and the life chosen. Thomas struggled with obedience, sometimes chafing under ideas that appeared harsh, but over time, he learned that discipline freed him from self-will and opened house for grace. The community was not ideal. However, it used to be a crucible for transformation. 9. The quiet moments no longer. All brotherhood used to be loud or public. Within the evening, Thomas commonly determined himself seated with Brother Ulrich under the historic yew tree, sharing a silent watch over the stars. In the refectory, transient smiles exchanged over a loaf of bread observed mutual working out. Within the script, a glance throughout the room could encourage a trembling hand. These quiet moments nurtured a profound intimacy rooted in shared intent and unspoken trust. 10. The love that binds monastic friendship used to be a love, in contrast to every other. Was once a love grounded not in possession or passion but in mutual striving for holiness. It was a love that bore weaknesses and celebrated strengths. Thomas wrote in his journal, "Our hearts are joined in a sequence unseen but unbroken. In each and every brother's wrestle, I see my own. In each brother's joy, my own is doubled." This love was once a foretaste of heavenly communion, a glimpse of the eternal fellowship promised to all who persevered. 11. The assessments of brotherhood and love used to be validated by using jealousy, ambition, or misunderstanding. Thomas discovered how Brother Edric's delight in his artistry normally distanced him, or how Brother Cadfael's disappearance left a wound of betrayal. But by way of forgiveness and beauty, wounds healed. The group realized to endure one yet another's burdens, as the rule taught. 12. The legacy of brotherhood. As Thomas matured in the monastery, he grew to become a mentor to more youthful beginners. He shared with them the teachings of friendship and community. He taught them that the path to God was not simplest by means of silence and prayer, however, by way of the reward of others. In his ultimate years, he would say, "We are pilgrims by myself, but we walk in a manufacture of saints." 1. The bell's name earlier than dawn. A single bell tolled through the cloister, clear and insistent, calling the monks from sleep into the embrace of prayer. This bell was once greater than a sign. It was once the heartbeat of the abbey, marking time now not by means of the solar but via the divine. Brother Thomas stirred from his pallet, rubbed the sleep from his eyes, and rose. The day was once measured, not with the aid of hours, but by the offices, the constant moments when the neighborhood gathered within the choir to chant, to pay attention, to present themselves in worship. 2. The divine office. The day-to-day cycle used to be punctuated by way of 8 canonical hours. Matins in the deep night lords at dawn, high early morning terce, mid-morning zext at midday, none mid-afternoon, sunset compline before restitch, and every office used to be a ritual of psalmody, scripture studying, hymn and prayer, weaving of the sacred story into the material of time. Thomas cherished the stillness of matins, when darkness held the abbey like a secret, and voices rose in trembling candlelight. At lauds, gentle spilled over stone and leaf, and the neighborhood greeted the day with hope and resolve. The workplaces weren't mere responsibility, but talking and listening between the monks and the divine. 3. Ora et labora, prayer and work. St. Benedict's rule enshrined the steadiness of ora et labora, prayer and work. Work used to be no longer punishment but vocation, a continuation of prayer within the fabric world. Thomas's work was within the scriptorium, copying and illuminating sacred texts with painstaking care. Others tended fields, baked bread, cared for animals, or brewed ale. Every undertaking, finished with mindfulness, was once in supplying a technique to sanctify the usual. Thomas commonly mused, to write a phrase is to form a prayer. 2. Until the soil is to till the soul. 4. The labor of the pious scriptorium was a sanctuary of center of attention and self-discipline. Hours passed as Thomas bent over vellum, quill scratching, ink flowing. The work demanded persistence, steadiness, and reverence. Mistakes could destroy weeks of labor. However, the striving for perfection used to be itself a prayer. Commonly, in the midst of copying the Psalms, Thomas felt transported beyond time, his palms guided via a drive unseen. The illuminated letters, shiny and golden, were as much devotion as ornament. 5. Communal ingredients, sat meal occasions. The brothers gathered within the refectory, sitting in silence. Food was once easy bread, pottage cheese, sometimes fish. Reading from scripture or the writings of the fathers accompanied the meal, nourishing each body and spirit. No phrases were spoken. The silence used to be a shared meditation. Thomas savored these moments, the style of the bread, the heat of the hearth, the rhythm of chant mixing with chewing. 6. The rhythm of leisure was once sacred too. Sleep used to be temporary but restorative. taken in bloodless, sparse cells. Thomas on the whole rose earlier than dawn to hope. However, he knew the physique wanted respite. Seasonal galas and Sundays supplied longer pauses, occasions for feasting, social gathering, and fellowship. The abbey calendar used to be marked by means of feast days of saints, holy seasons like Lent and Creation, and the exceptional galas of Christmas and Easter. Every punctuated the constant go with the flow of days, with moments of grace and joy. 7. The changing seasons. The abbey lived in concord with nature's rhythms. Spring brought renewal buds on trees, planting in the fields. The hum of bees. Summer was once a time of harvest and abundance. Autumn noticed preparations for winter, keeping food, repairing roofs. Wintry weather was once harsh and lengthy, with shortened daylight hours and bloodless stone. The monks adapted their work and prayer to these cycles, deepening their attention of God's presence within the altering world. 8. The self-discipline of time. Time used to be a strict grasp. The monks' lives had been governed by bells and schedules. Lateness to administrative center used to be no longer tolerated. Tardiness used to be corrected, but the rule of thumb balanced rigor with mercy. Thomas learned that discipline used to be now not oppression, however. Liberation, freedom to surrender self-will to the rhythm of holiness. This surrender, rough gain, brought peace. 9. The interior clock passed the outside agenda. Thomas developed an inside clock, a sense of non-secular time. He could think when prayer was once wanted, when relaxation used to be due, when work demanded his full awareness. This instinct grew through years of observe and silence. It was a subtle artwork, listening to the body, the soul, the spirit. 10. The gift of routine. The everyday cycle would look monotonous to an outsider. Thomas embraced it as a sacred gift. Each repetition was once a return to the wellspring. Every moment was an impossibility to meet God anew. Cycle was not a entice, however, a ladder steps, leading upward in humility and devotion. 11. The rhythm of group. The shared day-to-day timetable unified the group. Each monk's person rhythm blended into the refrain. This concord bolstered bonds and dissolved isolation. Together, they lived the guideline, a shared architecture of time and motive. 12. The presence in the usual. Thomas got here to look that holiness dwelt not most effective in amazing visions, but within the common moments. The echo of a chant, the scratch of quill on parchment, the breaking of bread. Every was once a portal to the divine. In these small acts, Thomas observed countless meaning. 13. Getting ready for the eternal. Sabbath, a day-to-day rhythm, was also a training for eternal rest. The monks lived with the realization that this existence was a pilgrimage. The cycle of prayer and work pointed towards the Sabbath pastime, the eternal peace of God. Thomas, more often than not, contemplated on the phrases of Psalm 90, "So teach us to number our days, that we may just observe our hearts unto wisdom." 1. The monastery as a beaconsome, distance past the stone walls and silent cloisters. The abbey stood as a beacon of hope and talents in a turbulent world. To the villagers, pilgrims and tourists, it used to be a sanctuary, an island of peace, amid chaos. For Brother Thomas, it was once a location where prayer met motion. The place contemplation bore fruit in carrier. The abbey used to be no longer a fortress towards the world, but a bridge. 2. The scriptorium, guardians of potentialone, of the most monastery's greatest presence to the sector, was the scriptorium, the guts of learning and renovation. Right here, monks copied historic manuscripts, sacred texts, classical works, histories, medical treatises. Brother Thomas, with steady hand and dedicated heart, labored over vellum, illuminating pages with gold leaf and shiny colors. Each and every manuscript used to be a treasure, a fragile thread connecting the present to centuries prior. Through their work, the monks safeguarded potential that could or else had been misplaced within the turmoil of the age. 3. Education and guidelines. The abbey additionally served as a school. Young newbies had been taught Latin, scripture, theology, and the humanities of studying and writing. The monks proficient neighborhood youngsters, nobles, sons, and usually even lay people. Schooling used to be not best intellectual, however religious, formation of intellect and soul. Thomas recalled classes in grammar and rhetoric, balanced with classes in humility and obedience. 4. The infirmary, cure body and spirit. The infirmary was once a significant part of abbey lifestyles. Monks cared for the sick. Each brothers and outsiders. Herbs had been grown in the monastery backyard. drug treatments prepared with ability and prayer. Brother Thomas remembered the tender care of Brother Edmund, the infirmarian, who tended wounds with persistence and compassion. Treatment used to be seen as a sacred ministry, a tangible expression of God's mercy. It improved beyond the bodily to the non-secular. Confession, prayer, and comfort. 5. Hospitality. Welcoming the stranger. Hospitality used to be a sacred duty. The abbey's guesthouse welcomed pilgrims, travelers, and the terrible guests got meals, refuge, and leisure, no questions asked. Thomas saw weary pilgrims arrive, their faces etched with hassle. The monks offered kindness and prayer, embodying Christ's command to welcome the stranger. This openness was a thorough act in a harsh world. 6. The economic function. The abbey used to be additionally a financial center. It managed big lands, farms, mills, and workshops through agriculture and craft. It sustained itself and the surrounding group. The monks' labor supported not handist their religious mission but also nearby economies. Thomas generally helped in the cellar, learning the art of winemaking. These realistic competencies had been a part of the holistic monastic life. 7. The abbey and the church. The abbey was once an important link in the church's constitution. It dispatched monks as missionaries, ambassadors, and advisors. It maintained relations with bishops, nobles, and kings. Thomas heard reviews of abbots negotiating peace or defending villages from marauders. Although cloistered, the monks had been engaged on the planet's affairs in refined reproaches. 8. The balance of cloister and outreach. The tension between withdrawal and engagement used to be steady. The rule of thumb emphasized steadiness and enclosure, but referred to as monks to charity. Thomas reflected on this balance, to be rooted in prayer, yet open past to the sector's desires. This dynamic formed his understanding of holiness, no longer as breakout, however, as service. 9. Renovation of culture by means of the scriptorium, schooling, and hospitality. The abbey preserved and transmitted culture. It was a guardian of Western civilization. In a time of upheaval, Thomas took pride on this legacy, seeing his work as part of a grand chain of religion and finding out. 10. Challenges and threats regardless of its items. The abbey faced challenges. Famine, warfare, and plague threatened its balance. Political intrigue and reforms established its autonomy. Thomas witnessed disputes over land and authority, yet the monks continued, rooted in prayer and neighborhood. 11. The abbey's religious coronary heart. Amid all these roles, the abbey remained a spiritual sanctuary. Every act of learning, medication, and hospitality used to be rooted in prayer. Thomas believed that the abbey's true reward was once its witness to God's presence in every project. 12. A legacy of light watching to the future. Thomas hoped the abbey's gentle would continue to shine. Its manuscripts, prayers, and hospitality were seeds planted for generations. In his journal, he wrote, "The monastery is a lantern in the darkness, a home for the weary, a tuition for the soul." 1. The shadow of dying inside the abbey walls. Demise was once a consistent presence. The plague, sickness, accidents, and old age claimed brothers with quiet inevitability. Brother Thomas walked the cloister with the expertise that any day, perhaps, his last. The proximity of loss of life sharpened the monks' focal point on the eternal. It was each a worry and a caller summons to live with intention and give up. 2. The preparation for Miss monks lived with an awareness of their mortality, cultivated through prayer and ritual. Day-to-day workplaces incorporated prayers for the death and the lifeless. The rule of thumb of Saint Benedict recommended the monks to meditate most of the time on dying, no longer morbidly, but as a spiritual discipline. Thomas determined that this meditation was once a source of peace. He wrote, "To remember death is to remember existence. It humbles and frees." 3. The final rites. When a brother fell unwell, the community gathered. The infirmarian tended the physique. The abbot or priest administered the last rites: confession, anointing, and the Eucharist. Thomas recalled comforting Brother Gilbert in his final hours, whispering prayers and preserving his hand. The deathbed was a sacred position where lifestyles and eternity met. 4. The burial ritual. The burial was simple, however profound. The body was once washed, clothed within the addiction, and carried to the cemetery. Monks chanted the administrative center of the lifeless, invoking God's mercy. The grave was a humble location, a reminder of the body's return to dust. and the soul's ascent. Thomas ordinarily helped dig graves, feeling the weight of mortality in his palms. 5. Legacy via manuscripts and memorial. Thou, the physique perished. The monks sought to go away, a long-lasting legacy. Manuscripts copied and illuminated have been gifts to the Church and future generations. Thomas understood that his writing was once a technique to communicate beyond the grave. The group also preserved reminiscence by means of oral way of life and chronicles. These legacies related earlier, present, and future within the continuum of faith. 6. The hope of resurrection. Vital to monastic hope was once the notion in resurrection. Demise used to be now, not an end. However, a passage. Thomas discovered solace within the phrases of the Psalms. Necessary within the sight of the Lord is the loss of life of his saints. This hope modified fear into trust. 7. Mourning and comforter. Monks mourned their brothers deeply. Grief used to be expressed through prayer, silence, and communal aid. Thomas remembered the loss of Brother Willem and how the abbey grieved together. Mourning was additionally a testimony to like and the bonds cast in lifestyles. 8. The everlasting captive monks anticipated demise as entry into the eternal Sabbather rest beyond labor, a peace past prayer. This imaginative and prescient sustained them by way of suffering. Thomas on the whole meditated on the promise of everlasting life, retaining it like a beacon in dark nights. 9. Writing for eternity. In his later years, Thomas committed himself to writing reflections on death and hope. His journal became a testimony to his trip. Sincere, uncooked, and hopeful. He hoped his words would relieve others going through the equal shadow. 10. The cycle of existence and death. Abbey's calendar marked the cycle of lifestyles and demise, with feasts like Any Saints and All Souls. This present day have been times to do not forget the departed and renew religion within the communion of saints. Thomas participated in these rites with reverence, feeling related to a titanic non-secular household. 11. The peace past. Finally, Thomas located peace, no longer in averting loss of life, but in embracing it as part of God's plan. His ultimate journal entry. Learn, death is a door opened by grace. Past it lies gentle love and the voice of the liked. 1. The silent witness. As Brother Thomas's days within the abbey drew to a detailed, he mirrored on the existence he had lived. A life marked via silence, now not vacancy. However, a profound witness to presence. The quiet hours spent in prayer and contemplation were not escapes from the sector. However, a deep engagement with the divine mystery. His journal captured this reality. In silence, I have heard the voice that speaks without sound. The monastery, with its partitions of stone and hearts of faith, stood as a testimony to the vigor of stillness. 2. Prayer, as the breath of life. Prayer had been the rhythm of his days, the breath that sustained the soul. By means of chanting psalms, meditating on scripture, and silent adoration, Thomas located a wellspring of strength. He understood prayer no longer as mere ritual, but as relationship, a living speak with God. Even in instances of doubt, the dependency of prayer tethered him to hope. 3. Solitude and neighborhood, a sacred paradox. Monastic existence balanced to seemingly opposing forces, solitude and community. Thomas skilled solitude in his cell phone moments of quiet reflection, wrestling with his inside demons, but he was once by no means real. Alone, the brotherhood formed a dwelling network of help, love, and accountability. This paradox being by myself, yet collectively used to be on the coronary heart of monastic spirituality. 4. The rule of thumb, as a devised rule of Saint Benedict, provided constitution, self-discipline, and knowledge. It shaped daily existence with its emphasis on obedience, humility, and steadiness. Thomas saw it as a map for the soul's journey, guiding monks by means of silence, work, prayer, and fellowship. Its knowledge transcended centuries, nonetheless valuable to seekers in these days. 5. The monastic influence. The legacy of monks like Thomas elevated some distance past the abbey partitions. Monasteries preserved competencies, fostered education, and served as facilities of healing and hospitality. They formed medieval tradition, spirituality, and society. The monastic best influenced reform movements, art, and theology for generations. 6. The brand new echo. The Middle Ages are far away. The call to silence, prayer, and solitude resonates still. In a loud world, the monastic disciplines offer a refugia technique To reconnect with deeper truths, Thomas's trip invites us to take into account how silence and group can coexist in our own lives. 7. Lessons from the cloister. From Thomas's diary, we gain knowledge of the vigor of silence to transform, the need of prayer as relationship, the present of community amid solitude, the grace observed in battle and perseverance. These classes remain vital for religious seekers. 8. The journey continues. Story ends within the abbey, but the monastic ride is timeless. Each monk who lived, prayed, and worked left a footprint on the path towards God. His diary is a window into that sacred pilgrimage, a testament to human longing and divine grace. 9. An invitation. The means is not just for monks, that it invitations all who search that means to enter into silence, cultivate prayer, and include solitude no longer as isolation, but as a doorway to communion. Thomas's life is an invite to step past noise into the sacred rhythm of presence. 10. The ultimate reflection. In his final journal entry, Thomas wrote, "May my days be remembered not for deeds done, however, for the quiet love given and got within the presence of God. The monastery's stones may climate, the voices could fade, however, the legacy of silence, prayer, and solitude endures, a light shining by means of the centuries."